hello. Okay, this works. Great. So, hi. Yeah, my name is Radoslav Stankov. You can find me pretty much as R Stankov pretty much everywhere. Like, this is my handle pretty whenever I am in the internet. I come from a very small country called Bulgaria. And since I'm going to have a lot of code examples in these slides, and people always, when I have presentations, I notice people doing stuff like that. Like where you're doing a talk and you notice people with phones and you have to like paste yourself and stuff like that. So because of that, I'm actually posting the slides there on this on speaker deck with all the addresses. All the code is in GitHub. All the things are now linked there. So after the talk, if you need any of the code I'm showing, you can just take it. You can take pictures now, like. Yeah. Okay, all done. This will be also the last slide of the presentation, so if you don't know if you want to take photo now, you can take it later. So yeah, I work for a company called Product Hunt. It's a San Francisco remote-based company. We work on this website for discovering your new favorite things and help you launch your startup into the stratosphere. So a little bit of our history. So when I joined the project in early 2014, Product Hunt was just like a jQuery spaghetti situation, very messy, very bad. My first job was actually introducing components into our systems, having to add a little bit more software engineering stuff. And back then, the popular kit in the block was called Backbone, and it actually was the first thing which make you think about components on the web. Before that, the way we call components was something which is a word which nobody uses anymore. It's called widgets. It's a very unused word anymore. So later in February 2015, we switched to React and Rails. Then we had something named Flux appeared on the sideline, which was a design pattern, and its most famous implementation is Redux. So we switched to Redux in 2015. 2016, we officially became like a single page app when everything was driven by the React router. Then we introduced Redux to help us deal with our React stuff. And our last major architectural change was in February 2017. It was introducing GraphQL into our stack. So this is like the history of like our tech stack. A lot of decisions we make are just because our system started like 2014 and now it's like 2018, it's somewhere down there. So our project, this is the structure application for the front-end part of our project. This is like pretty much how our directories looks like. This is like the stuff I'm seeing pretty much every day. So today I'm not going to talk about the highlighted stuff. I had given a talk before about React at Product Hunt on architectural level, like how we deal with Redux, how we do more, how we structure application, and more like a high-level overview. Also, I'm not going to talk about the GraphQL part and the pages part. I covered those also, like GraphQL at Product Hunt, which was again a bit more architectural discussion. Today I'm going to focus on this single folder, components. And I wanted to focus on it because I wanted to show you like some of the patterns we use when we designed our smallest components, because those small decisions actually affect our application at the most. And the decisions we take when we build a small component are actually small decisions we take every day. And knowing how to take correct decisions on the smaller level actually makes your application a lot more better and a lot more easier to maintain. So I have identified like 3 types of components we have in our system. I call them generic components, utility components, domain components, and pages. Pages are very simple. They're just pages. Like this is the component holding the whole page. And I'm not going to focus on it today. Today I'm going to focus on our 3 main types of components: the generic component, the utility component, and the domain component. And those are terms invented by me. So there I haven't seen them like very spread, but basically most React components I think are into those 3 buckets. So what's a generic component? Like the generic component is just something you have, you can duplicate and reuse it in different places in your application. You can set it some settings, you can put it there, and you work with it. A very good example of a generic component, this is our style guide. So at Product Hunt, since we have a lot of freedom and limited development resources, we are very strict about what type of fonts, font sizes, and all that stuff we have. So in our style guide, we are listing our fonts. So we only have like 5 sizes of fonts. And having this is isolated into component, which we called very like smartly the font component. So we have our font component, and this is how our font component directory structure look like. We just have a components folder with fonts, and there in the index.js we are keeping the file for the component itself, and in style CSS we are keeping the style for the component. So this is the first pattern we are very heavily using. It's called component as folder. It's a quite popular pattern when you deal with React. The idea there is your component is not just one JavaScript file. Your component can actually is a folder as a package which contains the code for the component, some SVGs, for example, some images if only this component needs, some style, some utility JavaScript stuff. In our case, it includes some GraphQL stuff. It can include some subcomponents. It can include like nested components. If some people put in this folder also the test for the components, we don't do that, although I really want to do that. But for legacy reasons, we don't keep the test in our components. But if I'm starting a new project, I would put the test here. The idea of this is that your component is an isolated thing. You very easy know what the dependencies of your components are and how to move this component in and out in your system. Like if you, for example, want to use this component in another project, you just know I take this folder and know the playing dependencies. So let's see our font component. So what does a font component needs? So the font component is just a simple, that's the way we use it. We just import font and we just say font text and we render some text. So this is how you use the component, nothing magical. The way this component looks like is, this is its code. You get React, you get the children, you render children around the spam, and you use those styles here. So those styles are actually coming from something from this file here. So the styles of the component are grouped with the component itself. And for this, we use something called CSS modules. What CSS modules does is it gets a CSS file and a JavaScript, and this CSS file can be imported into a JavaScript file, then passing them to the magic of the CSS module Webpack plugin. You actually get a new CSS file where the class name of which you added has like this nice suffix which makes it unique, and the value of the styles.text is actually also like uses the same value. The idea here is I can have a style which is named text into like 20, 30, 40 CSS files, and in the end when my bundle is compiled, all those files will be unique. All those class names will be unique. The nice thing about it is I don't have to spend much time in thinking how to name my CSS stuff. I don't have to deal with things like some weird naming schemes and other stuff. I can just have a very simple class names, and I know that, okay, I have all the CSS needed for the component in one reusable place. So when we have our component, the font text, the way it's rendered, it just have like a span with a class text and it shows up. And that's nice, that works great. But the thing about here is, this is a span. What about if we need to use a div or a paragraph? Like sometimes we don't want to like wrap 20 components one into another. So what we do often is This is another pattern we use. We call it component as props. The idea here is we have a property which is called component, and we say for font text we use the component P. The component just string P. This just renders a paragraph. If the nice thing here is we can also pass a component which is a real React component, and the way it nests those components together. So what happens here is, for example, I'm passing a P tag here and I get a P tag back, but if I pass a custom link controller from the router, I get a link with the href and all of that. So how does this work? It's like we call it, as I said, custom component as props. This is something we use pretty much everywhere where we have like reusable components. This is the way we can actually wrap components with each other, and this is like a very useful technique, and this is something very useful and simple to implement. So how is this implemented? So the way we implement that is we have a property which is called component, and here we just assign it to a variable component, and we check, okay, do we have a component? By default, you span, then just reuse this component here and delegate every property you don't know about to this component. And this is a very simple way for you to achieve multiple components. And by looking at this code, I noticed something very weird, like children here is past children here. So we can just simplify it a bit and just delegate the property of children to the rest of the component. So this code actually becomes a lot more simpler. And also in this way we can support another pattern which is called children as function. Like in this way you just pass it by, and the wrapping font component doesn't care what happens down the line. What this component only does is attaching a class name to the wrapping component, and this class name actually contains all the logic for the fonts. But what about, like, now we have this, but let's say I need the custom class name. Like some of the fonts, like let's say I have like a font and the font works well, but now I have to add some margins, some paddings, some other weird stuff. And it's often needed to add an extra style. This is something we also use a lot, since if you have like a reusable component and putting this component anywhere in your application, there is always a padding or margin problem, even though we all use flex type now and all that fancy stuff. So it's very useful to have like a class name. So this is another pattern used quite often, is to pass an extra class name as a property. So pretty much all our reusable components support class name. And the way we support the class name is we use an npm package called class names. It's very, how to say, imaginative name. So the idea of class names is you just do yarn install or npm install and you get the class names. And the idea here is you can actually pass it different types of arguments, and in the end it generates a valid class name. So in this way we can actually be quite smart about it. So now our component is like quite simple, quite good. But here I actually have no idea what kind of properties this component takes. Like we don't use prop types. What we use is something called flow for having like an optional type system. So what flow does is you can actually define types. You can say, okay, I have a type which is topic, and this topic has these particular fields. You can specify if fields can be null or not. That's the question mark. So if something has a question mark, it's optional. And this allows us to have like a function. Let's say this function takes a user type, a topic type, and returns a boolean and does something with them. If we pass null and a valid topic, if we pass a user and null, flow type is going to reject this during compilation time. So the nice thing about flow type is it's when you are passing your build step, that's where your code is checked, and all the flow type annotations are removed from your system when your JavaScript bundle is compiled. That means you actually don't have any runtime errors or runtime costs for the type system. The nice thing about it is it also doesn't allow, for example, a boolean to be assigned to a number. And it only allows the stuff which actually works, that you're passing a valid types. So why is this good for React? The nice thing about here is, let's say we have this user image component. And the user image component have two types of options of properties it can take. It can either take window white and height, or it can take a variant. So in our application, we have like 3 types of images, but sometimes some of the designers decide that 3 types of thumbnails are not the best thing ever, so we add a 4th. But with prop types back in the day, it was kind of impossible if you see a component which gets this, like white with plus variant, or white with height with plus variant, what's going to be executed? Like you have to go to the component and read the code and think about it. With float type, you can actually have this type definition, which is a bit hard to read, but it says that the props can either be user with white and height, or variant, which is only one of those 3. And it will blow up in the top cases where it cannot be used. So float type is very similar to TypeScript. Like the main reason we use float type is because TypeScript didn't work with React when we started using React. And when you have like a large code base, it doesn't make sense to add a new language when Flow is good enough solution. And some people may argue that even Flow is better than TypeScript. I cannot say who is better. If I make a new project, I'll just do the research. So yeah, we have a type safety. The way that we add the type safety is here we say we accept a component, which is any, because the component can be pretty much anything. Like it can be a function, it can be a React class, it can be a string. And the class name, which is a string. And now like we are safe. So that's pretty much the component, how it works. But notice here, we have so many options here. Like we don't only have like a size, we have like font weights, and we have a lot of options. So I'm going to quickly glass through this. It's basically our component has all these options like class name, colors, component size, should the word be uppercase or not. And basically here what we do is we use the class names to compute a very complicated long class name. And this works quite well, this works quite nice. And it's very hard to keep maintaining because this is a very powerful component with a lot of variations, and if you give this to developers, it becomes really messy. So what we do is we actually have precomputed sets. This is a pattern I like to call component packages. We have like a parent component which has like a lot of properties, but then we have another on this component itself, like attributes we attach other components which are just pre-select sets of this component. So we say we have secondary text which is uppercase, true with the font weight normal, the feature text is large with the weight light, but the headline is extra large with bold. And we are strongly encouraged just to use those. And we mostly use those because they're easier to use. But when we need to use that, we use the rest of them. So the nice thing about it is when we import font, we just use those, and it's kind of readable. Also, those are like, in our case, very semantical. So when I have a headline, I don't have like a secondary text, I have a headline text. Also, the component as packages is something we use for our form components. The form components is, instead of importing like 15 components, you just import a single component form. And you have form field, form buttons, and all of this. And our forms are quite complicated, and I would most probably do a separate talk for them someday when I'm not so embarrassed of them. So this is the generic part. It passes a big chunk of the presentation, pretty much the half of it, and I'm on the mark, kind of. I'll speed up the next part faster. So the next stuff I'm going to talk about is the utility components. This is like the components which are weird components. Those are like your weird uncle in the family because you pretty much put everything there you don't care about. So one component we have is called window resize. The idea of this component is you pass it a handler, and every time the window resizes, it's called this handler. So this is something a concept which is becoming quite popular right now. It's called renderless components. It's components with render null, but they do something. And in this case, we just attach some DOM handlers, Like we attach a window resize event, we handle that. We don't re-render this component never, we render it and we just trigger our resize event. It handles throttling and all of that. And it's quite simple. We have a couple of those. Like we have something called scroll observer, which notices when something scrolls. We have key handlers. And they're quite useful because you can, for example, get a model window, and in the model window you use, I have a key handler X for closing, key handler escape plus for going to the next page and stuff like that. And actually your component becomes quite readable with actions. Another useful component we have is add body class name. That means that when your component is attached to the DOM tree, you have a component which goes to, you have a class name on the body. For example, the background of the whole site becomes red or green or whatever, which is like a very surprisingly useful thing. We also use another pattern which is called functions as props. For example, our error messages component gets a function as a props. It gets an error and can render the error in a different state. The way this component is implemented is also quite simple. There is some yada yada useless stuff. But the nice thing is we get an error message from the form. If there is no message, we return no. So this is the business logic. The function stuff just gets rendered, and we always try to have like a default case. So when you don't need any styling, you can use that. This is something we use quite often. Also, for example, another example is we have a clock component which renders time, and it also uses a function as props. The idea is we mostly try to use functions as props for stuff which query and can do some interesting stuff. This is like how the component is rendered, like a long component. Also, we have this very interesting component. It's called visible if. Visible if actually does a lot of checks. For example, if the user is logged in, it shows a logout button. If the user is not logged in, it shows a login button. And we use function as props here to check if the user is logged in, show one or the other, so we don't have two components in the DOM. Also, this component supports like screen sizes. It checks if the screen size is mobile, we show a sidebar. If it's mobile, we show a tab bar. Like it's a very flexible component, and we also have it with feature flags. So yeah, this is pretty much most of the talk is done. The last type of components I'm going to talk about is called domain components. The domain components are components which are connected to your domain logic. Like in our case, if we see this screen here, this is a domain component. This is a component representing some real usage data. Like this is a topic in our application. And this topic has a topic item component, a topic image component. The idea is topic image component is separate because in some places we just use the topic images without the topic item. Again, we reuse the font title, the font silent text. The topic follow button is also here. It's a very separate component. It's actually a very interesting component I'm going to show at some point. And yeah, in this domain component here, it has a lot of imports, but it's quite simple to read. So it's basically a div with class names. Here again, we use our favorite class names because the component items can be used in different places. It has a link to the topic image. So when you click on the topic image, it's a link. You have the topic title and you have the topic follow button. So this is how the directory of the topic item looks like. And this is a very interesting file. It's called a GraphQL fragment. I won't go deep into the GraphQL stuff, but what GraphQL does is it allows you to define what types of data your component needs. And the way it does it is you define it with fragments. So for example, I say my topic item depends on this data from the topic. Like it depends on ID, name, slug, description. And it also inlines the other two components, topic follow button and topic image. And during compilation, so when we get this data, we don't care what data the topic image needs and the topic follow button needs. So whatever I change the topic follow button, I don't need to go back and change, for example, my API calls. So basically what happens is the topic item just picks all the data here, but it doesn't know if those components actually load more data from here. It's darkness for them. So the other interesting component is the topic follow button. It's actually a component which does something. It's not only displaying stuff. But what we're trying to do is when we have a data operation, when a data operation happens, what we do is we try to push the operation as close as to the component where this data is triggered. For example, the topic follow operation is not on the top level on the topics list page because we have topic follow buttons everywhere. So where we put the logic of what the action is when you click something, we put it very close to the metal, very close to the component. It's actually we put it into component topic follow button. And the way we put it is we have these GraphQL mutations, and mutations defines actions, API actions. So how this works? First, this is the fragment of the topic follow button. It needs three things: the ID of the topics, the name of the topic. I don't know why it needs the name of the topic, but I guess it needs it. And is the topic followed by the current user? And the mutation is a bit more complicated looking. Actually, it's pretty much the same logic, but it's a bit more complicated because it has more structure, because it mutates. And mutations are always scary and complicated. So we have operation which is called topic follow toggle. The idea of topic follow toggle is you either follow true or follow false because we are too lazy to have two functions. And then it returns, then it updates two fields. The updates its followed field based on the ID. And this is like handled automatically by GraphQL Apple library. So this is like the action button. We have a lot of like action buttons in our system, and basically what they look like is they get some properties, and from the topic they get if the topic is followed. This is another reusable component we have. Like many times you have a button, and when you click this button, something asynchronous happens, and you have to stop this button to be clicked twice. It's good to have like loading text or some other useful stuff. So we have like this loading button, and what it does is you pass it on click handler, and when this click handler returns a promise, it waits for the promise to be resolved until the button can do stuff. And also it disables the button and shows like a loading text which can be set. Another interesting thing you can see here is we have like the class names. So you see we use these class names everywhere. Also, this data test attribute, this is the way we do full stack testing, is we append those data test attributes. Since we cannot rely on stuff like class names anymore, we just annotate all the important logic in our application with these data test DOM attributes. These things actually go to the DOM. And when we do Selenium tests, with Selenium we can say, find an element which has a data test of topic toggle follow button and click this button. And again, the click handler is quite simple. Checks if the current user is logged in. And if the user is logged in, we just trigger our previous mutation. And if the user is not logged in, we open like a pop-up, please log into the website because blah, 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 yada, 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 yada. And here is like how we get, this is like a very complicated looking thing, comes from Apollo. That's how, with this other component, we have kind of the mutations. And this is map state to pops from Redux, where we check if there is a current user. And basically we check if there is a current user, if the user has an ID. So that looks nice, that's quite, and having these components in this level of separation is now if you want to build a bigger page, like let's say the topic list here, we can just build it by reusing our components. We used our box component, which of course is a box with some action bar, which is another usable component we have, which is called search field. We used another utility component, which is called infinite scrolling. The infinite scrolling, you just provided a loading component, which is just like those placeholders you see on Medium on Facebook, where you see like boxes with like loading indicators. Then we have a topic list component, which has inside a topic item component, then a topic image component, a topic title component, and all of this is like reusable on pretty much every level in our application. And the nice thing about it is, from the GraphQL part, is that the topic page only loads the topic items data. It doesn't know about the data here.
So every time we make changes, we don't need to change anything. So yeah, this is the domain object, and that's pretty much what I was wanting to talk about today. So yeah, that's all. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a happy rest of the day. Thank you very much. This is the code, and this is the slides.
Thanks, Radoslav.